Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom from the holy city of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. Today, the 18th day of the month of Adar, the year 5778, corresponding to the 5th of March of the year 2018. And today we have a new beginning in our study of the Tanakh, our study of the books of prophecy and wisdom. Today starting in the second of the Trei Asar, the second of the 12 shorter prophets, the prophet Yoel, known to the English-speaking world as Joel. Yoel, one of the great prophets of Israel, and we should be continuing with the help of God with our studies of the rules of the rinsing and salting of meat in preparation for cooking to remove all of the blood, and looking once again deeper into the mystical and Kabbalistic dimensions of these commandments. So without further ado, except to remind everyone that with the help of God we shall be continuing our studies this week at the regular time, that is to say on this coming Thursday, and next week we shall be studying also with the help of God on Sunday, Monday and Thursday, with our last session being on Thursday, March the 15th. And then we will be breaking for the month of Nisan and the festival of Pesach, and with the help of God resuming our regular Kollel studies here online on April the 15th. There will be a slight change in the timing next week to account for our brothers and sisters who are in United States of America, who will be having a summertime clock change as the beginning of next week, and the regular time of our class for those in USA will be the same as it is now. In other words, according to the new summertime clock, the hour of the beginning of the class next week will be just the same as this week. For everywhere else who have not changed to a summertime clock, the hour will be 1 hour earlier for the live transmission, and God willing, archived versions of the classes, both in MP3 format and in video format, are available from azamra.org website and from YouTube. And with that, then, let us now launch into our study of the prophet Yoel. Shalom, today, the 18th day of the month of Adar of the year 5778, corresponding to the 5th of March of the year 2018. And today we embark on our study of the second of the Trei Asar, the second of the 12 shorter prophets, the prophet Yoel, known to the English-speaking world as Joel. And before we enter into the text of the prophet, this is one of the delights of the Trei Asar, that is that the overall length of the different prophets is certainly much shorter than the three major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Not to say that the Trei Asar are any less in stature, but the scope of their prophecies is less in terms of chapters, with Hosea at the beginning and Zechariah towards the end having 14 chapters, and most of the others having considerably fewer. Now, there is an interesting feature of the order of the Trei Asar, that Yoel, the prophecy of Joel, comes immediately after that of Hosea. And that does not necessarily reflect the historical period in which those prophets appeared. There are a number of different rabbinical views about the identity of Yoel, the son of Petuel, the author of the prophecy of Yoel. Some consider that this is actually the son of Samuel, who is mentioned in the first book of Samuel in chapter 8, verse 2. And we see there in Samuel that Samuel's children did not live up to the very high standards of Samuel himself. And according to the view that Yoel is indeed the son of Samuel, the name Petuel is a reference to his having persuaded God to accept his teshuvah, and he attained the rank of one of the prophets of Israel. However, there is a different opinion. There are two other opinions regarding the time frame of Yoel, whose prophecy is not really dateable internally, because it's all concerned with a terrible plague of locusts against which he warns, and his call to the people, to the priests and the Levites and the people to repent. It was clearly timed in the time of the first temple, but when exactly this plague of locusts was, we shall have occasion to discuss when we look into the text. But the other aspect of Yoel is some of the most flighty and eloquent prophecies about the time of the redemption, when the spirit of prophecy will again come into the world. And one of the three opinions about the time frame of Yoel is that he was in the time of the son of King Achav, that is Yehoram. And the story of the end years of Achav and the years of Yehoram are told at the beginning of second book of Kings. But there seem to be no particular textual references to this time frame, although there was a famine at that time, and it is possible to deduce that there was a plague of locusts. Another opinion, and this is the opinion that is accepted by Rabbi Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, in the introduction to the Mishnah Torah, is that Yoel lived in the time of King Menashe, son of Hezekiah, one of the later kings of Judah, who actually went racing after idolatry and brought it right into the temple, but was then captured by the Arameans and submitted to terrible tortures, and repented and came back to Jerusalem and instituted a rule of Torah law. And certainly the prophecy of Yoel reflects a time when the temple is the center and the focus of the people's lives, because the horror of the plague of the locusts is that Among other things, it makes the offerings in the temple impossible. So we get a picture of the spiritual life of the people at that time, and the plague of the locust is an ecological disaster of the most immense proportions, as we shall see described in our text. Again, we shall come to discuss in more detail what these 4 species of locusts are. But to get back for a moment to Maimonides in his introduction to the Code of Torah law, the Mishnah Torah, there he traces the transmission of the oral Torah from Moses on Sinai through Joshua and the elders and the prophets down to the times of the later prophets. And as we saw in our study of the prophet Hosea, Hosea was the first of a line of prophets. According to Maimonides, there in Mishnah Torah, based on the Midrash Seder Olam, the one that received from Hosea was Amos, although his prophecy comes after Joel in the writing of the Trei Asar in the Hebrew manuscripts. And Maimonides then traces that the tradition went from Amos to Isaiah, and from Isaiah to Micha, and from Micha it came to Yoel. Now, all of these names are known to us as prophets. These, according to Maimonides, were the Nasi, each one in his time, that is to say, the president of the Sanhedrin, the spiritual leader of the time. And their prophecies are their message to the people of their time and all of the generations afterwards, because all of the prophecies that were recorded in the Tanakh were recorded because they have relevance to Israel for all time. So with that introduction to Yoel, let us now turn to the Hebrew text of the prophecy. Devar Adonai asher hoyo el Yoel ben Pesuel Shim'u zois hazekenim ve'ha'azinu kol yoshvei haaretz hehoyeso zois b'yemeichem ve'him b'yemei avoseichem. He's calling on all of the elders who have some knowledge of history to testify that never before has there been a plague such as he is now prophesying that is destined to come upon the land. Hear this, because this is the message of the leader of the generation, calling the people to repent, warning them what is to come. Verse 3, Oleho Liveneichem saperu, uveneichem liveneihem, uveneihem ledor acher. This is to become part of the tradition of Israel for all time, this prophecy of the locusts. And now in verse 4 we have the terrible, the forbidding, grim warning. Yeser hagozom ochal ho'arbe veyeser ho'arbe ochal hayolok veyeser hayelek ochal hechosil. Here in this verse we have the names of 4 species of locusts: the gazam, the arbe, the yelek, and the chasil. And all of their names have special connotations, and perhaps their species are known to experts in the field of species of locusts. where the plague of the time that Yoel is prophesying differed from the plague of the locusts in Egypt was, in Egypt there was only the one kind, the arbe. But here are coming these 4 species, one after the other, and whatever the gazam has left will get eaten by the arbe. Whatever the arbe leaves behind will get eaten by the yelek, and whatever the yelek leaves behind will get eaten by the chasil, so nothing will be left. In Hebrew today, lechasel is an expression to absolutely devour something completely. So the name of this species has to do with a devouring of all crops. So now the prophet is calling to the people to wake up from their drunken stupor. Verse 5. Hokitzu shikorim uvecho vehelilu kol shoisei yoyin al asis ki nichras mipichem. The people are drunk, the people are in a stupor from spirits and from wine, and they now need to weep and to mourn because all juice, all the asis is going to be cut off from your mouths because of this imminent plague. Verse 6. Ki goy olo al agretzi Otzum ve'ein mispor, shinov shinei aryehi, umas le'ois lovi loi. So here, this prophesied swarms of locusts, this is a whole goy, a whole nation that has come up upon my land, says God, atzum, mighty, and mispar, no ability to count them, countless. Shinov shinei ariyeh, the teeth of this nation are sharp like the teeth of the lion. Maslaos, the grinding teeth, are those of a lavi lion. Well, now, from this verse we can perhaps take an opportunity to consider the mashal that the prophet is giving, because as we have discussed at the outset of our discussions of prophecy, the key terms needed to interpret the prophecies of the prophets are the terms mashal and nimshal. God speaks to us in terms that are familiar to us from our world, and yet these terms are laden with meaning. They become the bearers as metaphor and as simile for a higher meaning that is the nimshal, the message to which the metaphor alludes, to which the symbol alludes. So the question we can ask ourselves to consider is, notwithstanding that certainly in the land of Israel there are infestations of locusts that can be totally destructive, but clearly with the whole background of rabbinical midrash, here where there are 4 components of this nation, they would seem also to allude to the 4 exiles that were to afflict Israel and Judah in the coming generations, these being Babylon, the exile of Persia and Media, the exile of Greece, and the exile that continues until our day and until Mashiach, the exile of Edom. And perhaps in the depiction that we will now see in the prophet of the devastation coming to the land by this successive infestations of locusts, that these also allude to the swarms of the armies of the invaders and the occupiers of the Holy Land from generation to generation, and that would particularly enable us to connect the two main themes of Yoel together, that of the plague of locusts with that of the end of days, because indeed we are in the times of the wars of Gog and Magog. The great sage of Israel, the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Kagan, in the 1930s, already saw the Second World War as the second phase of a protracted war of Gog and Magog, the first having been the First World War with all of the attendant wars and ravages in Eastern Europe and Russia. And he foresaw that after the war that he could see to be coming, the Second World War, there would be a third phase. And these are successive waves of occupiers or controllers of the land of Israel. So with that perspective in mind, let us go back to our text and consider what this invading nation is doing to the land. Som gafni leshamo useinosi liket sofo chosoif hasofo vehishlich hilebinu sorigeho. So here we begin to have referred to the special fruits of the land of Israel, particularly in this verse, the vine and the fig tree, which have been ravaged, destroyed, and splintered. He's speaking in the past tense about what he sees coming as if it has already happened. So real is it in his mind. They're tearing off the bark of the trees so that all of the running roots of the trees and the branches are all stripped bare and white. And now in words that are incorporated into the synagogue service on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, mourning over the destruction of the temple, one of the kinot, one of the dirges, has as its refrain this verse 8 of Joel chapter 1. Eli kivesulo haguras sak alba nehureho. Eli, not to be confused here with either a divine name, my God, nor to me. This is from a root of alala, of screaming and howling in mourning, like a virgin maiden that is clad in sackcloth over the loss of the husband of her youth. And here in this opening depiction of Yoel's call to Teshuvah, we have the maiden of Israel who in this catastrophe afflicting the earth, the land, is bereft of her husband, the Holy One, blessed be He. And he's calling on the people to understand how dire the situation. Verse 9, Hochras minecho vonesech mi beis Adonai ovelu hakohanim meshoresei Adonai. The mincha offering, those are the flour offerings offered daily in the temple by the high priest and other circumstances. Nesach is the libation of wine. The mincha offering would also include olive oil. So here we have 3 of the 7 species, the vine again, the wine, and the wheat and the olive. And they're being cut off from the temple, which is the center of the national life, is leading to the priests, the servants of Hashem, being in a state of mourning, completely bereft, with no purpose there, with nothing to offer on the altar. And the devastation in the temple is the root of the devastation in the whole of the land. And now with wordplay here in the coming verse 10, Shudad sodeh ovelo adomo ki shudad dogon hoivish tiroish umelahalithor. The city, the countryside, has been plundered. The earth and the land is in mourning because the corn, the grain, has been ravaged. The tirosh, the wine, the grape juice has dried up, and the olive oil is wretched. Here we have the three components of the blessing in the second paragraph of the Shema. If Israel will keep to the commandments of God, He will give us your grain and your wine and your oil. But now here in this situation, it's the opposite. And with the land in this state of devastation, so are the farmers in dismay. Hoivishu ikorim, heilelu koremihim, al chito ve'al soiro, ki ovad ketzir sodeh. The Ikar is the farmer. He's in a state of shame in his dismay at the loss of everything. The Kormim are those who guard the Kerem, who tend the Kerem, the place of the growth of the vines and other fruit trees. Helilu, he calls upon them to howl out in their mourning over the wheat and over the barley, because the produce, the harvest of the field has been lost. So another of the 7 species now introduced, the barley. And again, the olive oil came in the previous verse, and now we continue in verse 12. Hagefen hoivisho, vihateino umelolo, rimoin, gametomo v'sapuach, kol atzei hasodeh yoveishu, ki hoivish sosain min b'nei Adam. The vine has dried up, the fig tree is wretched, the pomegranate now the 6th of the fruits of Israel, gam tamar, also the fig, the date palm. So here we have had now all of the 7 species which the land of Israel is praised, together with the tapuach. The tapuach can be a name for any fruit that has the form of an apple, which is considered to be like tapuach is one that is somewhat swollen. There is a targum on, I believe, Kohelet, that translates the word tapuach as, it might be on Shir Hashirim, that translates the word tapuach as the etrog, the citron, which is also a fruit that swells in its ripeness. And so that will be another of the outstanding fruits of Israel that is subject to this ecological disaster. All of the trees of the field have dried up, and all joy has dried up from the sons of man. That is to say that this is a situation of the flight of the divine presence from Israel owing to their sins, and the prophet now brings a classic call to the people to repent. And some of the passages from the prophet Yoel are included in the same haftarah that is read on the Shabbat after the New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and before the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, on Shabbos Shuvah, the Sabbath of repentance, together with the closing chapter of Hosea, Shuvah Yisrael. Here we have Yoel also calling the people of his time to true repentance. Verse 13, which begins a new parasha stuma in the prophet, the call to true repentance. Chigeru b'sifedo hakohanim heilelu meshoresei mizbeach bohulinu vasakim meshoresei Eloi Kini mena mi beis Eloheichem mincho vonosech. Gird yourselves with sackcloth and burst in mourning and lamentation. You priests, the priests in the time of the temple were intended to be the teachers of the people, to set the example, and they now, since it was the temple that was under their responsibility, that was afflicted, they must now burst into mourning. You who are the attendants of the altar, you must spend the night in your sackcloth, you ministers of my God, says the prophet, because deprived, withheld from the house of your God is the mincha grain offering and the nesech wine libation. So that's picking up, obviously, from the previous parasha, and now calling the people what they are to do. Kachutzom, kiru atzorom, isfuze keinihim, kol yoishvei ha'aretz, beis Adonai Eloheichem, vezahaku el Adonai. Sanctify the fast, that is to say, you have to call it in advance. A fast is not just that you wake up and you don't eat because you don't feel like it, and you call that a fast. A fast has to have a hazmanah, appointed a time when it is to begin an announcement. One has to accept it on oneself as a fast, and it has to be a sacred fast. It's necessary for an assembly of the people to be called. The elders have to be gathered together, all the dwellers of the earth, to the house of God, and to cry out to God. Maimonides, in his code, in the laws of fasting, explains that at the time of the fast, the elders have to gather and examine what is wrong with the people that is causing this affliction. And here we are hearing the prophet call to a people who, if they had sense, would respond to his words and had the understanding that such an ecological affliction is indeed heaven sent, and that's what he's telling them, to understand that what is happening around is not happening by chance, sent by God, and it's to God that we have to plead for his intercession. And if you think it's far off, he says, whoa, verse 15, aha, layom, ki korov yom Adonai, Ucheshod mishadai yovo. Woe to that day, for near at hand is the day of the Lord, this day of judgment. Ucheshod mishadai, like the shod, the devastation, the havoc, the destruction that comes forth from the eternal God. So, for certainty is it to come, says the prophet. The name Shaddai is sweetened by the Yud at the end of it. And when the Yud is absent from the name, we are left with Shod, which is robbery, havoc, destruction. And when the divine presence leaves Israel, what is left is the Shod, the havoc and destruction. And he's saying, can you not see already this destruction that is with us? Verse 16. Halohi neged einenu oichel nichros Mi beis Eloheinu simcho v'gil. Look right in front of us. The food is cut off from the house of our God, are cut off all joy and delight. And now, talking about the depicting in the coming verses, the picture of the devastation of this ecological disaster, the complete failure of all the crops having been devoured by this invading army that he foresees. Verse 17. Oveshuferudois tachas megrafoiseihem noshamu oitzorois neheresu mamegurois ki hoivish dogon. Well, there's some different interpretations of the Hebrew words of verse 17. In the opinion of Rashi, who brings the opinion of the Targum Yonatan, the frudois are barrels of wine that have sprouted all kinds of decay because they're being empty. And the Magrafoi Sehem, according to that interpretation, will be the stoppers of the barrels of the wine, and that would make sense in the context of the continuation of the verse, referring to the other species, the species of the grain. Noshamu oitzorois, the otzarot, the treasure houses where the wealth, namely the grain, is stored, is devastated. Nehersu mamagurois, the barns where the grains were processed have been utterly destroyed. Ki hoivish dogon, the grain has failed, dried up. And in this dire situation, Ma nehenecho v'heimo novoichu edreihi v'kol ki einem ederohem kam edrei atzoin neshamu. How does the behemah animal groan and the herds of the cattle are in this bewilderment because there's no pasture for them, and the sheep and the goats, the flocks of the sheep and goats, they are in this state of devastation, and there's no other direction for the prophet except in verse 19 he puts the words into our mouths, words in response to any devastation, in response to any disaster. Eilecho Adoino yekaro ki ehi shochalon ohis midebo velehovo liato kolatzei hasodeh. To you, O Lord, do I call out, for fire has eaten up the beautiful places of the wilderness, and a flame has flickered over and devoured all the trees of the field. Verse 20, Gamba hamoi zesodeh taharoi keilecho ki yoveshu afike moyim. The animals of the field too are groaning and yearning to you, O Lord, because the well springs of the waters have dried up and fire has devoured the beautiful pastures of the wilderness. With that, we come to the end of chapter 1 of Yoel, and to the end of a parasha in the printed scripts of the prophet Yoel. And let us, before leaving this chapter, just reflect on the difference in the style between the prophet Yoel and that of Hosea. The style of Hosea is a Hebrew that is far more terse and condensed, and in many places very obscure and hard to fathom, highly elusive. The style of Yoel is somewhat freer and certainly with tremendously vivid imagery in his depiction of the army of the locusts, and we shall have more of that in the coming sections, and his depiction of the ravages with the animals parched with thirst and hungry, and the priests in the temple desolate, the farmers with the barns, the granaries, all very, very descriptive, and yet heavily cloaked in allegory, and appropriate not only for a generation that had the temple, but also for all of our generations, because the prophet is pointing to the way that the surrounding ecological disasters are ravaging all of the true fruits of our lives, our wisdom and understanding and knowledge, our good deeds. We are all in such a deep exile with the in parched wildernesses. So the prophet may be taken on many levels, and his words are appropriate to our generation as to all of the generations. So with that, let us now take a brief interval, after which we'll come back to our studies of the laws of the rinsing and salting of meat in preparation for consumption. Back now to our studies, turning to the subject of the laws of the salting of meat in order to remove the blood. Shalom, today the 18th day of the month of Adar of the year 5778, corresponding to the 5th of March of the year 2018. We continue with our studies in the work by the late Rabbi Aaron Pfeiffer, Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, on the laws of the prohibition of blood and the salting and roasting of meat to remove the blood. We come now to chapter 3 of the section dealing with the rinsing of the meat prior to the actual salting process. And the question we shall be addressing now is, what would be the law if meat was salted without previously having been rinsed, as we have studied in the previous sections? And as we come to see how the halachot play out in practice, what we shall encounter is the way that from the outset, Milachatchila, we always try to integrate all of the different halachic opinions and to do what we do in the best way possible, limahadrin, to follow all of the opinions just as far as possible. But when something goes wrong and we are in a b'diavad situation where something has happened, as we shall see, there are circumstances in which we are able to, in which the rabbi is able to rule more leniently. So if meat had been salted without previously having been rinsed to rinse off the surface blood, etc., that meat is forbidden for consumption, and it would not help to go back and rinse that meat and salt it over again. And the reason is because we are concerned that the reason for the rinsing is to remove the surface blood so it won't get absorbed back into the meat. And as soon as the meat was put into the salt, the salt would immediately cause any blood on the surface of that meat that had not been rinsed to be absorbed into the meat, and it will not be able to be removed from the meat through salting, because salting of meat does not have sufficient power to cause blood that had been on the surface of the meat, was absorbed into the meat, to be exuded. Now that would apply even if the salting in question, namely the meat had not been rinsed, but the meat was only salted in a rather light way. That is where the law applies, that it would not be possible to kosher this meat anymore by salting. So even if only a small amount of salt had been applied, the way that meat would be salted for roasting purposes, and even if the salt had not remained on the meat for the requisite time of salting, which we shall come to when we come to the laws of salting, approximately a half an hour again for the meat to remain in the salt. Even if the meat had only been lightly salted and was not left in the salt for the full requisite time frame, nevertheless the meat is still not able to be koshered anymore, because we fear that the salt has caused the surface blood on that piece of meat that was not rinsed to get reabsorbed and will not be able to be brought out by salting. However, the law changes if the meat had not been rinsed and was salted. It will be possible to kosher it if through the method of roasting on the fire. And the law is that if the meat had been salted with a lot of salt, in the way that meat is salted for the purpose of koshering the meat, and also if the salt had been on the meat for the full time frame of the salting period, then this meat not only could not be kashered by salting anymore, it could not even be kashered by roasting the meat, even though fire is considered to be have a greater power to cause the absorbed blood to be exuded than salt does. The reason for this law is that where the meat had been salted with a heavy application of salt, and it also remained for the requisite time frame for the sitting in the salt on the surface of the meat will cause blood that wasn't on its surface, had not been washed up, to get absorbed and entrenched very strongly in the meat, to the point that even roasting will not be sufficient to draw that blood out. But if this meat had not been rinsed before the salting, if it was rinsed with a heavy layer of salt but did not stay in the salt for the full time frame, there is a difference of opinion among the poskim about what is the law. There are those who say that since it was not left in the salt for the requisite time, then the salt will not have caused any blood on the surface to get reabsorbed and entrenched strongly, and therefore even though salting would not help, in this particular case roasting would help after the event, b'diavad, to draw out any blood from the meat that got reabsorbed through being heavily salted, but it had not been left in the salt for the requisite time. There are others who say that even in this case it will not be possible to draw out the blood from the meat even by roasting. Now, if it was the opposite way, that the meat that had not been rinsed was salted with a light layer of salt but was left in the salt for the requisite time frame for the salting, here the later poskim have a difference of opinion, are doubtful about what the law should be, whether it is possible to draw out the blood with roasting or not. And here it is the actual practice would be to take the more stringent opinion that where the meat had not been rinsed prior to the salting, if it was left in a small amount of salt before the requisite time, it would not be possible. We would have to discard that meat. Now, if the meat that had not been rinsed was salted with only a minimal amount of salt and also did not stay in the salt for the requisite time of the salting, in this case, even though rinsing the meat again and salting the second time will not help to kasher this meat, nevertheless everybody would agree that it is possible to kasher this meat by roasting over fire to draw out the blood. Now, wherever roasting the meat is able to help in such cases for meat that had been salted without being rinsed beforehand, after the roasting process, it is then possible to cook that meat. There's no prohibition anymore on cooking that meat after it was roasted in order to draw out the blood, because the power of roasting the meat is sufficient to draw out all the blood that was still absorbed in the meat, and there's no further fear that if we cook that meat, there's more blood to come out that will get reabsorbed. Now, all of the above laws that we have looked at, we've been discussing what happens if the meat was not rinsed before it was salted, and we've seen where the law, melechatchila, from the outset, would be to rule that meat inadmissible, that it will not anymore be able to have the blood drawn out of it. All of this applies in the case where there is not a significant financial loss in discarding that meat. Where there is no significant financial loss, then we rule that where the law states the meat must be discarded, it must be discarded. However, if there was in fact significant financial loss in discarding that meat, then the Rav would be able to adjudicate using the more lenient opinions as we have discussed, and it would be possible in some cases to save that piece of meat for use. Where there is significant financial loss, even if the meat was salted without being rinsed beforehand and the salting was in a large quantity, and the meat had been stayed in the salt for the full period of the salting time frame. In the case of significant loss, it is possible to rule more leniently and to permit that meat through rinsing it now again and salting it a second time. Well, now we come in the second section of this chapter to another series of laws which relates to to meat that was salted without being rinsed beforehand. If there was a quantity of meat that was 60 times any blood that may have been on the surface of the meat. We've already encountered the concept that a prohibited item is normally considered to be nullified if there's 60 times the kosher food to nullify the effect of the unkosher food. And obviously, where meat has come from the slaughterhouse and has traces of blood on it, the blood will not necessarily be a very significant amount in relation to the amount of the meat. So if meat had been salted without being rinsed prior to the salting, if it was quite clear that the quantity of meat is 60 times any blood that was on its surface, here the law would be that it is permitted to rinse this meat and salt it a second time. And the salting will avail to kasher that meat. And the reason is that the whole fear that blood on the surface of the meat would get absorbed back into the meat through the salting process is according to the first of the four opinions about why we have to do the rinsing before the salting, namely that blood on the surface might get absorbed back. Well, if the quantity of meat is 60 times the total of the blood on the surface, that means the quantity of meat will nullify the effect of any blood on the surface. However, even if there is 60 times the quantity of meat more than any blood on the surface, the law is that it will be necessary wherever there had been a blood on the surface of that piece of meat that was salted without being rinsed, it would be necessary to peel off what is called a kalifo, a sliver of the meat where there had been blood on the surface and the meat had been salted without being rinsed previously, because we are concerned that perhaps any blood that was reabsorbed into the meat did not actually extend into all of the meat, but stayed near the surface, which is highly likely. And in that case, such blood would not be nullified by 60 times its quantity, because it's all concentrated in one place. And that's why we slice off the kedei kalifo. And this is a concept we should be coming up with time and time again in the laws of kashrut, cases where some kosher food has come in direct contact with some treif, like if a piece or something forbidden, like if a piece of meat came in contact with a piece of cheese, it might be necessary to cut off this kedei kalifo. Sometimes we need to cut off a thicker slice, a chaticho, a slice, but in this case, the kedei kalifo, just peeling off a sliver, would be sufficient. Now, our rabbinical authorities have estimated that in a regular piece of meat there will not be a quantity of meat 60 times any blood on its surface. How they made that calculation, I don't know, but our sages are invariably reliable in these estimates. But they estimated that normally, min hastam, in other words, without further qualification, normally a quantity of meat will be 30 times any blood that is on its surface. And this leads to an interesting consequence. Therefore, if there was a piece of meat that had only had half of it rinsed, and the other half had not been rinsed, and they went and salted this meat that had only been half rinsed, we may presume that since half of it was rinsed and there was no blood on it, it's only on the other half that there is blood, that there will in this case be 60 times the quantity of meat more than the quantity of blood on the surface of half of that piece of meat. And for that reason, we would say that except for slicing off a sliver, any blood that was absorbed in such a case into the meat would be nullified by the quantity of the meat. Now, another consequence of this law is in the laws of the salting of poultry. Because obviously a chicken, for example, a portion of chicken that's come from the slaughterer and is ready to be salted, in the case of the chicken, it is considered that the meat of the chicken will have 60 times the volume of meat to any blood on its surface, the reason being that on the chicken there's no blood on the outer surface of the body. The chicken will be salted when it's been feathered and its skin exposed, and that will not be where blood is. The blood will be on the interior of the body of the chicken, and that's why, since the piece of chicken are considered to be have only half the blood possibly on their surface as a regular piece of meat if it's not been rinsed. That's why the law of chicken is more lenient here. If a portion of chicken had not been rinsed prior to salting, that the quantity of the chicken meat is considered sufficient to nullify any blood that may have been reabsorbed into its surface. Now, meat that had been rinsed in the proper manner, but then after the rinsing and prior to the salting, the person cut up that meat into several pieces. We've already discussed that it's necessary to rinse that meat again because of blood that will exude from the place of the cuts. Now, if in this case the person did not rinse that meat a second time after cutting it up and went ahead and salted it, here the law is exactly the same as the laws of any other meat that was salted without being rinsed. However, again, if they cut this piece of meat after the rinsing into two pieces in such a way that the only location of any blood on the surface is where the actual cut was made, in this case, we would estimate that there will be 60 times the amount of meat to any blood on that surface, and for that reason, it will be permissible to rinse that meat and salt it, as we discussed earlier. Now, all of these laws where the more stringent opinion is taken, all of these laws apply only where there will be significant financial loss if the piece of meat had to be discarded. But where there will be significant financial loss, even if one salted meat without having had it rinsed previously, and even if the salting was a large quantity of salting, and the meat stayed in the salting for the requisite time frame for salting, where there is financial loss, it is permitted to go back and rinse that meat properly and salt it again, and the salting is considered to avail to kasher that meat. The reason being, even though with regard to the four opinions about the purpose of the rinsing, even though we take the view for the halachah that the main purpose of the rinsing is in order to remove the surface blood from the meat, as discussed earlier, nevertheless, where there would be significant financial loss, we would rely upon the second opinion about the purpose of the rinsing off of surface blood, being that if you didn't rinse the meat and the meat was salted, the salt would lose its power because of the surface blood, and therefore the salting will not avail. But now, according to that opinion, if you rinse off the meat and salt it again, it will avail. So here, in a case of significant financial loss, we rely upon that more lenient opinion. And here we see the way that the halacha actually works, where in cases where it is possible to do everything according to the correct procedure, milachatchila, from the outset, we endeavor to do that. But in cases where there could be some financial loss involved, and this would be particularly painful to a person who was not wealthy, and the rabbi needs to see what can be done to save the meat of this person, it would be possible to use his expertise on the different views and rule more leniently. So with that, we conclude our study of the halachot, and now return to the inner meaning of the halachot as brought out by Rabbi Natan of Breslov in his discourse in the section of Yoredea, the second section of Shulchan Aruch, in his discourses on the laws of prohibited fat and blood. And in the previous section, we were discussing how it is that the offering of the animal sacrifices in the temple, where specifically the blood of the animal is dashed on the side of the altar or sprinkled or daubed, while the fat is burned on the altar. This, says Reb Nosson, while forbidden fat and blood are precisely what can fill people's minds with different levels of denial and atheism, when the fat is burned on the altar and the blood sprinkled on the altar, this brings about a great tikkun. And now, continuing with this discussion, Reb Nosson comes to the actual purpose of the salting process. So here we are in the subject that we are discussing now in detail in Halachah. All of this that we've discussed above relates to the salting of the meat. It's necessary to salt the meat in order to draw out from the meat all of the blood that may be still absorbed in the meat after the slaughter. And the reason is that salt is in the same category as a fast, and in the same category of suffering, both of which scour off the sins of a person, whether through his penitence through fasting or through suffering, be it illness or reverses and other suffering in life that come upon him. Like our sages have said, the concept of the covenant is spoken over salt. That is to say, the Torah tells us that in all of the sacrifices in the temple, there is a covenant of salt, that salt may never cease from the altar of God. So salt here is considered to be an aspect of God's covenant, always preserving the people. Now, salt is also used to evoke and describe suffering, like rubbing salt into wounds, and there are verses in the Tanakh that speak about the salt of suffering. And said our rabbis, it's a passage in the Talmud in Tractate Brachot, Daf Hey, just like salt actually sweetens the meat by drawing out bitterness and other impurities, so too suffering clean off and scour off the sins of the person. And suffering is also what we endure on a fast day when we deny ourselves the nourishment of our bodies. And the fasting is called ta'anit, from the Hebrew word ainuia, torment, and of suffering and chastisement. Like in the Talmud there in the same passage, it speaks about the land of Israel, which only is acquired through suffering. And there, in support of that teaching, the rabbis bring the verse from Deuteronomy where Moses said that just like a man may chastise his son, so God chastises Israel. And there, the verse is speaking on the subject of fasting as well, because it was speaking about the manna which God withheld and only gave at appointed times in the day to Israel. This was a withholding of their food for the other hours of the day. That is an aspect of fasting, like Moses says to Israel, speaking about God's treatment of them in the wilderness. He tormented you and made you hungry. He gave you to eat the manna. And for that reason, continues the verse, you should know this day that just like a man chastises his son, so God chastises you for his benefit. So the words in the verse in Deuteronomy, that he tormented you and he made you hungry, this is the aspect of the suffering of fast, where a person makes themselves hungry. And so our rabbis of blessed memory have said in the Midrash on this verse, he tormented you and made you hungry, that they used to be in a state of fasting prior to eating the manna in order to cleanse out the food that was still remaining in their intestines, because the manna is an aspect of holy eating, which we attain to through uniting the Holy One, blessed be He, and His indwelling presence face to face. That is to say that when we eat with the intention of sustaining our bodies, providing fuel for the wick on which our soul burns, the soul is the Shekhinah indwelling in our bodies. And when the soul is able to dwell in the body, this is the aspect of God's presence dwelling in the physical body, and the Holy One, blessed be He, the influence of the soul, is now face to face with the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence, which is dwelling in the world. And this level of holiness in eating can only be attained when a person first denies themselves food through the fast. And that's why, according to the Midrash, children of Israel would fast before they ate the manna in the wilderness. They had, besides their manna, they had livestock, animals, which apparently they were able to slaughter at the very least for peace offerings, so they didn't have other foods in them besides the manna. But they had to undergo this process of self-purification in order to rise to the level of the holy eating of the manna. And that's why our rabbis of blessed memory have said that the Torah was only given to those who ate the manna, because the Torah itself is all emunah. It's all belief without any possibility of proving it empirically, scientifically. As it's written in Psalms, all of your commandments are emunah. And this nobody can attain except by first breaking their innate physical appetite for eating as an aspect of lust and desire. And this comes about through the self-denial of fasting, or perhaps in our time of very careful dieting and eating only for spiritual purity. And then the person attains eating in holiness, which is on the level of the eating of the manna, because the one depends upon the other. That is to say, through perfect emunah, a person is able to attain the level where their eating is eating food that has been cleansed and refined to the point that it's all sustaining the soul. That is holy eating. And when a person breaks their innate lust for food by means of fasting, and the person thereby sanctifies his food, there the person attains greater perfection of faith. So to return to the subject we are discussing, it comes out from this discussion that the fast is an aspect of chastisement, which is the same as the concept of the covenant of salt, which sweetens the meat, which removes the impurities. And that's why we have to salt the meat, in order to expel any remaining blood absorbed in the meat tissues and fibers. And this is an aspect of fasting and suffering. In fact, before we're able to cook our meat, we have to go through the process of half an hour of rinsing and half an hour of salting before you can begin to eat the meat. That itself is an hour of fasting, but he's drawing the parallel between the salting process of the meat and the aspect of self-sanctification through careful discipline in our eating, which scours and cause to be exuded from the person all the bad blood in them, which come about through all of the different bad desires of the world and all of their sins, through which the person's faith is blemished and harmed. For through the fasting we're able to subdue the klipat, the world of the husks, the impure spiritual forces, and all of the desires that draw their nourishment from a person's fallen speech. Where the person's speech falls into the exile of Egypt, the person is unable to pray. All this comes about on account of a welling up of the power of this bad blood in the person, which was the very essence of the exile in Egypt. So the conclusion of this discussion is that the fasting has the power to subdue and to cause to be exuded from the person the bad blood. And let's keep in mind, we are talking simultaneously on the physical and the spiritual levels. The bad blood, these are the husks, these are the physical lusts and desires, which represent a flaw in emunah, in complete faith and trust in God. And that is done through the salting, through the fasting, and that's why we have to salt the meat, because the subduing of the blood is specifically through the salting, which is the same concept as the self-inflicted suffering we impose upon ourselves in a fast. And we shall come after this to the next section of this discourse, which deals with the Hasidic dimension of the specific procedure of the salting process. So with that, we conclude our studies for today, and with the help of God, we'll be meeting again this Thursday at the regular time, and as mentioned earlier, next Sunday, Monday and Thursday for people in the United States of America at the regular clock time of our class this week, so it will be on your clock next week after the change to summertime. But other locations, the timing will be 1 hour earlier on the clock, as we announced in the forthcoming Azamra weekly study schedule. With that, my dear friends, I wish you bracha and hatzlacha, blessing and success, and shalom from here in the holy city of Yerushalayim.